All right, we are live.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lauren. And welcome everyone to this webinar on the intersection of systemic racism and voting. My name is Peter Bakken. I'm the Justice and Witness Coordinator for the Wisconsin Council of Churches. Wisconsin Council of Churches is partnering with Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice in an initiative called the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign. And this is a nonpartisan project to work with and through faith communities and in partnership with community voting and voting rights groups to increase voter turnout and registration this election year. And we're especially concerned to increase turnout from those communities which have traditionally had lower levels of voter turnout and therefore have been underrepresented. Their interests and their voices have been underrepresented in policymaking at all levels of government. And that is why we're offering this webinar on some of the obstacles to voting that are faced by communities of color. And I'll turn it over to Rabbi Bonnie Margulis to introduce herself.
Hi, thank you, Peter. I'm Rabbi Bonnie Margulis. I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice. We are a statewide interfaith education and advocacy organization. We are very happy this year to be partnering with the Wisconsin Council of Churches on this project, and we're delighted to bring this webinar to you tonight. We're very excited to hear from our speakers, who are just amazing people who have been doing great things in Wisconsin, and we're eager to hear from them. So we're first going to hear from Reverend Joseph Baring, who's the pastor at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Madison. Reverend Baring has been pastor of St. Paul's AME for the last 7 years, and he's a former board member of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, and I hope will rejoin our board when he retires this fall. So we're delighted to have him with us, and Reverend Baring is going to start us off with some words of wisdom from his faith tradition, and then we're going to have a conversation with Reverend Baring and with Shauntay Nelson, who is the State Director for All Voting is Local Wisconsin, and Ryeshia Farmer, who is the Rights for All campaign coordinator from the Wisconsin ACLU. These organizations have been partnering with us on our Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign, and we really look to them for their expertise and their resources, and we really, in many ways, take our lead from them in terms of what we should be advocating for and what we should be messaging out to you all. So we're delighted to be able to bring their wisdom to you all tonight. So I will turn it over to Reverend Baring.
Thank you, Rabbi Margulis, for the honor and the privilege of serving on this panel this evening. Let me first begin by saying that we are all community, fearfully and wonderfully created in God's image, and therefore all lives matter to God, including Black lives. Our Creator majors in human dignity and worth, and He does not discriminate because He is not a respecter of persons. He judges people by their character and not by the color of their skin. And He admonishes each of us to be imitators of Him. That means that we're to love as He loves, forgive as He forgives, do justice, love mercy, live in humility. By living in humility, I mean it acknowledges the fact that I am not superior to you, nor are you superior to me. God has gifted each of us with a right to freely pursue a life of happiness. And as community, we are required to work in unity for the prosperity of that community. Having said all of that, with this in mind, what part does racism play in God's desire for humanity? And how does racism impact the life of a person of color who's pursuing that life of freedom and happiness? I hope tonight, as the panel dialogues and discusses the issue of racism as it's related to voting, It'll shed some light on the issues that are pertinent to our community today. And so I look forward to the discussion. I look forward to enlightenment as we make this journey dealing with racism and its impact on not just voting, but on the lives of people of color. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Reverend Baring. That was a perfect introduction to this discussion, which we're going to begin. And just to kind of explain the format a little bit, Bonnie and I will be taking turns asking questions of our panelists. We'll be directing our questions, first of all, to one member of the panel, but then the others are more than welcome to chime in with follow-up and additional comments on the topic. And then toward the end of our hour, we will have time for people to have their questions responded to. We won't be unmuting people, but you should enter any questions that you have in the course of the discussion in the chat box. And we will be monitoring that, and we will get to as many as we can toward the end of the webinar this evening to get a response from our panelists. So I will start with a question which I'm going to direct to Shauntay, because I think one of the fundamental concepts that we're going to be wrestling with today is that of systemic racism. And I'd appreciate it, Shauntay, if you could tell us how should we define systemic racism, and how does it differ from individual racism?
Yes, well, thank you again, Shauntay Nelson with All Voting is Local. Thank you all for having me. When I think about racism, or even when I'm talking about racism as it relates to voting rights or within any component, I'm always very much interested in how people really define systemic racism. And so for the purposes of how I will share this information, I'll just kind of share from my perspective, and not just my perspective, even from what systemic racism is. And I liken it to structural racism, which is basically when multiple institutions collectively uphold racial policies and practices. It's basically, if we look at it from this perspective, I've said this quite often, it's a byproduct of 400 plus years of cognitive distortion concerning Black people. It's connected, when we talk about structural or systemic racism, it's connected to other components of racism. We have internalized racism, which are subtle and overt messages that reinforce negative beliefs. We have interpersonal racism, which includes racist acts as well as microaggressions. And we have institutional racism, which are policies and practices that reinforce racist standards. And so when I think about structural racism, I think about it from the component of looking at all 4 or 3 of these components, as well as systemic racism. And so when I think about that, it is basically a collective of forms of racism that we see sometimes in everyday behavior, and it may show up from multiple angles.
Thank you, Shauntay. So just to remind people, Shauntay Nelson is the State Director for All Voting is Local, Wisconsin. I'm going to direct the next question to Ryeshia Farmer from the ACLU. And Ryeshia, I was hoping that you could give us a little bit of kind of the historical background and kind of historically how has the right to vote traditionally been infringed for people of color?
Yeah, so again, this is Ryeshia. Thank you all for having me. I think historically, the way systemic racism has appeared in our voting processes has mostly leaned toward the sort of institutional piece that Shauntay mentioned, which again deals with policies and things like that. And so, from the very first elections, folks who experienced systemic racism weren't able to vote, right? The first people who could vote were white men, 21 years of age and older, had to own land. And I think what is interesting about systemic racism is that it can be generational. And so I think a lot of the ideals that stem from historic policies that only allowed 21-year-old property owning white men to vote still ring true. And we see that in our current laws, like you have to live at a certain place for a certain amount of time, that sort of thing. And so that's one example. I'll also say that some other places where we've seen systemic racism impact people's ability to participate in elections are polling taxes, voter ID laws, which are a little more recent in our history, literacy tests that slaves had to take in general, but often stopped them from being able to vote. And those literacy tests were impossible for really anyone to be able to take. So those are a number of examples that we've seen historically, systemically and institutionally. Policies exist to keep people from the polls.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to chime in on that before I give a follow-up question?
When we look at institutional racism, it really begins back with individual mindset racism. To understand racism, we'd have to go all the way back to the founding of this nation. And when the nation was founded, it was founded on we the people. During that period of time, women and minorities were excluded from we the people. And as the nation was developed and the slaves were brought to this country, they were not considered people, they were considered property. And after the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments were ratified, it changed the lifestyle and condition of these slaves. And those who were in power had to find another way to keep people in control. And those ways were the institutionalized racism that we see today. I heard it mentioned about the poll taxes and all of those other things that happened before. That was a Jim Crow. But then we moved from Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow. And so what we're looking at now is just a continuation of racism that began in this country from its early existence.
Right.
Thank you. Shauntay, did you want to add anything?
They've added, I think, quite a bit. The only other thing that I thought about was the component of gerrymandering as well as felony convictions, which are two ways that we still are in, where voting rights have been infringed for people of color. Sometimes just that whole component of, gerrymandering is a whole nother beast, if you will. But when you think about those, the ease of ways that individuals can be convicted of a felony here within the United States of America, that is one other way as well that readily comes to my mind.
Thank you. So, with 400 years of oppression and the last 200 years of keeping people from voting, it must be exhausting and wearing, and really gives people disincentives to even try to vote, to feel like their vote counts or their voice is heard. And Reverend Baring, I want to start with you. My question is, as a faith leader, what are the messages that you give to your congregation about why voting is important? How do you get past that feeling that it doesn't matter and it doesn't count and nobody's listening anyway, to get people out to vote?
I usually try and get members of my congregation to understand that that what they do impacts on the lives of other people. For example, voting, I try and get them to understand that voting is their right, and they should never let anyone deter them from their right. I pastored in Minnesota at one time, and when the voter ID issue came up, and we defeated it in Minnesota, but part of the reason with the voter ID was that people had become brainwashed to the idea that there was voter fraud and all of these other things that they flooded the mind of people with that confused people. And people voted to ratify voter ID, which was wrong. I try and get my congregation to understand that their one voice can inspire other voices. Their one vote can change the difference in a law, change the difference of the playing field. People have gotten to the point of where they say, well, my vote doesn't count. All votes count. And all votes needed to be, that's your right to vote, I tell them. That people died for your right to vote, for your right to cast a ballot, for your right to have your voice heard, for your right to elect someone to speak for you. And it's difficult sometimes because a lot of young people, I know my grandchildren at one time said, well, you know, granddaddy, I voted for President Obama and I still got student loans that are out of kilter and all of these other things. I said, yeah, but you voted in the general election. What about your local elections? What about the people that impact your life directly? You need to vote. That's the only way your voice is heard. And you must be important because of all of the suppression that's going on to keep you from voting. So basically that's, and for a faith community, there's a scripture in the Bible that says to he that knows to do good and do it not, to him it is sin. If you know that you're supposed to vote and you don't, that's against the will of God. It's against the gift that God gave to you. And basically, that's the viewpoint. I've been in 3 different states and I've watched voter suppression at different levels. And I just try to get people to understand that the most important thing that you have in your possession is your right to vote, your right to have your voice heard. And in the AME Church, we have to make a report on how many of our members are registered voters and how many they vote. And I make sure that my entire congregation that's voting age are registered voters.
That's great. I wish all our denominations required that. Thank you. Ryeshia, do you have something?
Yeah, I'd love to chime in a bit too.
Yeah.
And I think it's a surprise to all perspectives. So hopefully it still pertains to the faith community as well. But I think there's a misconception that our responsibility to electing and elected officials stops with, casting our ballot at the polls. And that's just not true. I think, Reverend Baring made a great point about general versus local elections. Also, just like after the elections are over, the work of our elected officials to represent us isn't done. So why should our work to hold them accountable be done? So I think, you always want to complement voting with having conversations with your elected officials, or at least just staying up to date about how they represent you and how they move in their seats, so that the next time that their seat is up, if you're unsatisfied with their performance in office, you vote them out. Or if you're super satisfied, then you make sure they stay in. So I say all that to say that we have a responsibility to not only exercise our right to vote, but to do the follow-up after we cast our ballots.
Great. Thank
Could
you.
I say something about that also? Because you made a good point about that. One of the things, though, that we do is after the person's elected and we're not satisfied with their performance, then we threaten to vote them out or we vote them out. We need to go beyond that. As soon as they start or stop representing us, that's the time to let them know that if you don't, you will be out. Don't wait until it's election time to get them out. You light a fire under them after you've put them into office.
Absolutely.
You follow their track record. You keep track of what they're doing, what they're saying. You make sure you call them. You talk to them. One of the things I learned about politicians is they might get 1 or 2 or 3 letters or phone calls from their constituents. When they start to get 10 or 15 letters or phone calls from their constituents, they wake up. And then they believe there's a problem. They start to act on it. So I would say that as soon as you put them in office, then you start monitoring their actions in office. And don't wait until election time. That's way down the road.
Mm-hmm.
You need to stay on them and hold their feet to the fire while they're in office.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Shauntay.
I was just going to say what both Ryeshia and Reverend Baring are speaking of. It's a process that I call the electoral process, and it consists of making sure that people are registered to vote, or making sure that I myself am registered to vote, voting or participating in that voting process, and understanding and knowing that it's issue advocacy. So we can't just vote and then back up. Now we have to think about the issues that are important to us and begin to advocate around those issues, as well as hold those elected officials accountable. And so that's like that there is like a 5-step process. But then in addition to that, we need to be able to, as we're holding individuals accountable, we need to be able to build our base, develop leaders, and literally recycle that process. I often tell people this, especially in Wisconsin, it is very rare. I'm also a registered lobbyist, so it's very rare that elected officials will run a campaign outside of an issue-based campaign historically in Wisconsin. And so typically, if we follow the history of their campaigns, literally what happens is they run typically on 3 issues, whatever those 3 issues may be, but it's typically 3 issues. So that's important to understand, because I often tell people, as elected representation, they are skilled and versed, and they've rehearsed those 3 issues. Where we come in as constituents is we then need to take the issues that are important to us and begin to educate and advocate on behalf of us and our communities around those issues once those individuals are in office. And so when we think about the issues that impact Black and brown people, people of color, we have to be willing to take our issues to those whom are designed to represent us, and in that way, build relationship with them, build trust with them, but yet make sure that they are aware that we are also watching to hold them accountable. I think when we start looking at it from that perspective, we can then begin to really eradicate, if you will, some of these aspects of suppression.
Thank you. That was really important to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, this all kind of leads into the other question that we're going to ask is, given these sort of disincentives and obstacles and discouragements from voting in Black communities and communities of other communities of color, how has this actually worked itself out in the ability of these communities to overcome systemic racism and affect the kind of change that that they need and that they're looking for? How have you seen this actually work itself out in policy?
Well, I'll share. Some of the ways that I've seen it work itself out is another thing that people may or may not understand is that when you vote, which is one of the things that I constantly tell people, when you vote, then when you call that representative's office, literally what typically they're going to do is ask you your name, and then they're going to make sure that you are in their district. One of the things that they probably ask your name and your home address. Once they do that, what they're also checking to find out is if you are a voter, right? When they look and they see that you are a voter, be it consistent or inconsistently voting, consistency, of course, creates more influence, if you will. But when they realize that you are a voter, you have a greater capacity, a greater ability to be able to really ask for what it is that you want. And I'll use this example. Forgetting the fact that I'm now a lobbyist. At the time, I wasn't a lobbyist, but because I'm very active, I vote, things of that nature. There have been times where I've been able to walk into elected officials' offices and ask for certain things just based on the fact that I am engaged. And it's not necessarily for me, it's for the community, of course, but ask for certain things. I think about here in the city of Milwaukee, early voting sites, and being able to say, hey, we don't have enough early voting sites, and really leading that work and working with our Common Council members, not just this year, but even for a 2018 cycle, really working to expand those sites. That we obtain that ability when they realize that, one, we are a voter, two, we are engaged. So when I think about how things have worked themselves out, I can see that those are ways. I mean, we also have on the flip side, and I'll share this really quickly, how individuals, people of color, Black and brown people, are limited by things like voter ID laws and the restrictions around those laws. Ryeshia talked about that earlier. And so when we think about that, we can look at the fact that usually when we, like, even though ID laws are free, or IDs can be free, or they can be obtained for free here in the state of Wisconsin, even if you don't have a driver's license. I mean, even if you don't have a birth certificate or a social security card, there's still a way. We have a process, it's called IDPP, where you can still obtain an ID. But sometimes there are still challenges because we have expenses that are connected to that, that ID. Even if it's not the documentation needed to obtain the ID, we have to also consider the obstacles that people with disabilities, the elderly, or people living in rural areas have to consider when it comes to transportation, and or for those who may live in more urban areas, what we have to endure if there's a need for the cost of parking. So just trying to think through, I guess, from both sides, how it can work for us if we are engaged around voting, and how certain laws disenfranchise us when we're not engaged around voting.
Yeah, I think it's really important to lay out that balance and the dichotomy, Shauntay. So thanks for doing that. But I also just wanted to say plainly, like, the fact of the matter is, like, if people aren't allowed to vote, then there's so much less representation again. And so what the reason that representation is so important is that there's a certain level of insight and perspective that you just won't have for a community that you don't represent, right? So, for me, it's important to have elected officials of color in office because they think about the things that Shauntay mentioned. They're going to think about some difficulties that systemic racism has perpetuated for Black and brown voters, like, having the funds to purchase your ID, having the transportation to be able to go to the DMV and get that free ID. These are all the things that not every other elected official might think about. And so, again, I just want to say plainly, like, there's just a level of insight and perspective that comes with being able to cast your ballot for someone who represents you best.
Yeah, thank you. And Ryeshia, I'd like to follow up on that. Both you and Shauntay have mentioned the voter ID laws in Wisconsin. What other sorts of voting requirements in Wisconsin specifically have the impact of disenfranchising people of color that you think are important that we think about? And I guess I just addressed that to Ryeshia, and the others can join in.
Yeah, I'll start, and I'll just go quickly since Reverend Baring has something to add. But I think there's two very specific examples that I can think about. First is, like, in Milwaukee, we saw in April what should have been 180 polling locations be 5. Just there's a number of instances in our history where situations happen like that on the fly that affect elections. And so then we saw, hundreds of folks of color scrambling to first find their correct polling location and then waiting in lines for 2 to 4 hours. Keep in mind that the pandemic is happening, and Black and brown communities are some of the most impacted in Milwaukee around this time, and still are. And so, again, that just gets at the representation piece and the insight that when you represent folks of color, you can understand making a snap decision to go from 180 polling places to 5. You can understand the impact that's going to have on people of color. The other example, and this has just been racking my brain personally for a while, is the residency piece and the specifically the residency requirement, like how long you have to be at a place to be living at a place to vote in that area, which recently changed from you can live at a place for 10 days and be able to register and vote there to now you have to have lived at a place for 28 days. And, for systemic reasons, for reasons related to systemic racism, Black and brown folks are some of the most at risk for eviction. So I'm thinking about all the people who have trouble maintaining a place for 28 days and how the laws really aren't written to keep them in mind. But I'll let Reverend Baring and Shauntay and whoever else wants to speak to other examples, speak to them.
You came up with a one good example in Milwaukee. I have most of my family's in Milwaukee, my daughter and grandchildren, whatever. And we have 6 churches in Milwaukee. And it was interesting when they cut 180 polling places down to 5. One of our pastors had to go all the way to the south side of the city to vote. That's where they had her, instead of the north side where she was living. And so those restrictions on polling places. The other is limits now that they put on early voting. The issue that you brought up about seniors not being computer literate or not being able to get out, where they've now said that they want to do away with mail-in voting. All of these different limitations are to suppress the vote. I think it came out that in 2008, more African Americans went to the polls than they had gone before. And when that was realized, all of these restrictions started to manifest because of the number of African Americans that went out to the polling places. I just read today that they're starting to restrict the polling places for the next election coming up. And I think the only way to get around some of that is you say, it's good to be a voice, but we need to be many voices. And so we need to collaborate with other groups that are fighting this same issue, that are fighting the issues of voter suppression and get out to vote. One voice is good, but you need a lot of voices. As we see right now with the protests going on, all of the voices now have changed the playing field. And I think that's the way we change the playing field when it comes to the elections and to voting. The census is another one, trying to get everybody out to the census. Every 10 years, they redistrict. But if we're not counted, if African Americans don't take the census, then that adversely affects us in our community, along with the voting.
Right. And I'll just share, piggybacking, one of the things that Reverend Baring talked about was voting sites. Ryeshia talked about this as well. I think one of the other ways that this shows up is when we are in a situation where we have a disproportionate number of sites based on those locations. So yes, we have the situation where we went from 180 sites down to 5, but even when we have maybe 180 sites, being able to look to find out, do we have sites in proportionate distance between for groups or pockets of individuals, right? Because if we have 180 sites and they're not spread out proportionately, it still creates a place of suppression within the voting experience. One of the things that we did, even coming into for the city of Milwaukee, when we were able to get this expansion of early voting sites, we literally sat down with the clerks and looked at a map of Milwaukee and just said, hey, given where we were at the last time, we see that there are gaps here and here and here. We're not going to tell you where to put those sites, but we'll tell you that there are it's going to take people too long to actually drive. And we think about things like individuals may not necessarily have a vehicle, or they may have a vehicle and may not necessarily be able to take that route. Some people don't have a vehicle, and we think about things like, if they have to catch 3 buses, what does that look like? if they have to catch multiple buses in order to cast their ballot. So those are ways as well when we're thinking about this particular work that we see votes being suppressed.
And you said something too interesting about people with transportation. A lot of our churches have started using church vans, because it's one thing to register to vote. It's another thing to get the people to the polls. And so faith communities especially ought to be using their vehicles to transport people to the polls to make sure people get there. The other thing is that you get discouraged at the polls when they tell you that you're at the wrong polling place. My wife and I had that happen to us twice, and we've been in the same place for 7 years, going to the same polling place. And they told us we were in the wrong place, and then we find out they changed our polling place without telling us. So those are things that we need to let people know, that this may happen to you, but don't be discouraged and not vote, because these are all means to discourage you and keep you from voting. And it's interesting too when you look at that about the polling places, because a lot of us are not educated or don't know about going into those areas and finding out, the setup with the polling places and how to get with the clerks to tell them, we need places here, places there. So I think that's another thing that comes up that people might need to be educated about.
Right, and I'll just share this, just because we're talking about polling places and the impact of interacting with clerks. For anyone who's looking at this or anyone who will look at it later, I want to make sure that we put a website out here that is, I call it a one-stop shop. It is myvote.wi.gov. You can log on to that particular site. You can find out where you go vote, who's on your ballot, who your clerk is. You can register to vote. You can do so many things on that particular site. It can be done in both, I think, English and Spanish at this point, but it is a state website, and you can find a lot of that information out. So again, myvote.wi.gov.
Thank you so much. I just put it incorrectly in the chat.
Yeah,
I'm gonna fix it.
I wrote it down myself.
It's the wrong dot, not in the wrong place.
To make sure other people get this also, I just wrote it down myself.
myvote.wi.gov. I'm sorry, I forgot the dot between my vote and Wisconsin. There we go.
Yep.
Now it's right. I go there a million times a day. I don't know why I don't know it. Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. I want to just draw out a little bit more, because I think that those of us who are kind of white and privileged don't always think about what the barriers are to voting, and you've named a number of them, but I wanted to see if we can maybe pull out some more that maybe are less obvious to people. So some people might think, well, what's the big deal about going to the DMV to get your driver's license or your ID? I went to the DMV, I got it. It took, an hour or whatever. It was annoying, but I did it. Not realizing that a lot of our DMVs have closed. The hours are only during working hours. There aren't evening and weekend hours. So if you work and you can't afford to take a day off of work to go schlep to the DMV, not to mention having to take 3 buses to get there, that's a huge barrier, even though the ID itself is free and you can get it even if you don't have a birth certificate or a social security card. So I think there are a lot of hidden ways that there are barriers to voting that again, those of us who have all kinds of different kinds of privileges don't really realize or think about. It's not obvious to us. And if we want to be good allies and advocate for change, what are some of the things that we should be advocating for, and how do we go about doing that?
Is that answer? Oh, go ahead, Ryeshia.
Thanks, Shauntay. I think one of the most important things we can do to start on a very basic level, and I think one of the easiest things that we can do, is advocate for as many options for casting your ballot as possible. So, Reverend Baring mentioned that there's been conversations about whether or not we should go all vote by mail or not do vote by mail at all, technology and things like that. But I think we should be able to allow people to register and to vote in whatever way makes sense for them, and not prioritize one over the other per se. This is the first year in my knowledge that vote by mail has been as big as it's been. And a lot of people are still adapting to that process. And so we still want to hold on to early voting in person, early voting, vote by mail, election day in-person voting, and allow people to make the decision for themselves based on their personal scenarios.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I 100% agree with that. I say we have to be willing to look at all components or all facets of voting and be considerate of the fact that you have Black folks whom have a history of taking pride in actually going into the voting booth and taking our 18-year-olds into the voting booth for the first time to cast their ballot and allow them to experience that. And we may not go down the history of how it came to be, but there's a certain pride within our culture where we really enjoy that same day, that day of experience. And then you have, I know there's been a lot of talk around vote by mail or voting, some people call it voting from home or voting absentee on reservations, but we have to remember in a lot of ways, some reservations don't have actual addresses. They may have a longitude, latitude, and that becomes their address, or it may be they may not have an actual address to have something mailed to. And so just really thinking about that as well, considering that as well as in-person options, because of the fact that sometimes those whom have disabilities are not necessarily able to vote without an ADA machine, which is America's with Disability Act. It's a machine that was made available through that act. And they may not be able to hold maybe a pen in their hand. And so when I think about these processes and what we should be advocating for, I think about multiple ways to return our ballot, including drop boxes. They're elected election workers. We need to have enough of them to process absentee ballots, as well as enough for them to actually be a part of that day of or early voting process. And then we have central count, which happens after the election. It's kind of like the conclusion of an election time frame. It's not necessarily the cycle, but a time frame, if you will. We also have to think about making sure that ballots are not rejected. We have a very challenging process here in the state of Wisconsin, where you have to, once you receive your ballot, you need a witness signature in order to have that ballot returned and counted appropriately. But making sure that that ballot is not rejected because maybe the witness left off their home address, which by law, they're supposed to provide their address. Having a way to basically cure that ballot so that we have a process to reach out to voters to say, hey, your witness did not provide their address. Things of that nature, as well as having just ample ways, drive up, day of, early voting, absentee ballots. So as many ways as possible as people can have to cast their ballot. But I think even just as important, having a way to educate folks around that particular ballot. And I'll share one more thing why this is important. We're coming up on August 11th in the state of Wisconsin, which is it's considered a partisan ballot. So we're going to be in a situation where we have to vote one party or the other, and we cannot cross over. We can't do a crossover vote. And so because we can't do that crossover vote, being able to know that when you get that ballot, you have to fill in the little bubble at the top that you're voting either Republican or Democrat in order for your ballot to be counted, because if you cross over. But if you just vote one party or the other, whichever you prefer, your ballot can be counted. So really making sure that, and I know that may sound confusing, but the best way for me to say that is this: at the top of your ballot, if you just fill in the little bubble, either you're going to vote Republican or you're going to vote Democrat, you select your names there, the machine will know which one to choose it'll just stay. If you choose one or the other, it'll stay in that lane only. And then you can cast your ballot. But just trying to have education around how to actually fill out partisan ballots so people's ballots are not sent back or thrown out or whatever it may be, whatever the process may be, because so many people have requested their ballots by mail.
You know, to piggyback on what Ryeshia said about that ballot, because my wife and I did absentee ballots, and I was looking at that ballot, and if you don't pay attention, it's confusing, and you will mess up that ballot. And like you said, it's partisan election if you fill out that bubble. But if you go down and look at Democrat, because it runs right close, Democrat, Republican run, and then the little line says stop here. But a lot of times you don't see that, and people are confused. The mail-in, and I think Shauntay talked about using all forms of voting. Because right now they said 30% of the ballots that came in the spring were mail-in. And they're looking now at trying to limit the mail-in ballots. And so you need to be able to vote in all of the different means of voting in case of some other restrictions on the voting.
Oh.
I have a couple other pieces, if y'all don't mind. I think, we've mentioned a lot about, the types of issues and types of confusion that could slip up. And so I think in addition to just general education and advocacy coming straight from like the Wisconsin Election Commission who runs the elections, another really important piece is to think about the communities who would have trouble with filling out a ballot. So like obviously elderly communities are likely to have trouble like with technologies, with requesting things online. They're also likely to have trouble with, seeing the line that Reverend Baring just mentioned that tells you to not pass that line, to not vote into the next party, which would then take away your vote for whatever election that you cross over in. People with language barriers, they need access to people who can assist them in completing their ballot. They need ballots to not only be in the English language. They need people at the polling places who can translate or more readily speak their language in case they have questions or concerns or need help reading the English ballots, that sort of thing. I just think there's work that we can do to think critically about the communities that might have trouble with little things like being able to request and read their ballot. And we should be advocating for solutions that mitigate some of those concerns and take away the trouble that they might have.
Great. Thank you. We're getting close to the hour, and I want to leave a little time for questions, but I just want to ask one more very specific question, direct first of all to Shauntay, is can you give us a concrete action, one specific thing that we can engage in during this election season out of all these things that we've talked about this evening?
Can I give two, or do you absolutely want me to give one? I'm just saying, because there are two things that are really needed. So, okay, I'll stick with one and then I'll throw the other one in the chat. How about that?
Sounds good.
Okay, so one of the things that you could absolutely do is we've put together, meaning All Voting is Local, in collaboration with the ACLU and other partners whom are a part of our coalition, municipal clerk toolkit. And it basically is a toolkit that helps you to be able to advocate to your municipal clerks around things that will impact or not just impact, that will create access to voting. You can absolutely reach out and convey that you want that particular toolkit, and we can get you that toolkit. And then the other one I'll put in the chat.
Great. Thank you.
We actually have the toolkit linked on our website, and I'm putting that URL in the chat, but it's kind of long. So Shauntay, if you have a better URL, that would be great.
In case you're looking for another concrete idea, it's important, to me, obviously, as someone who just cares about everybody voting no matter what, that we get as many people engaged in the process as possible, new folks. So my ask for everyone has been to identify 5 new folks. That can be a young person who's first time voting. That can be someone who was maybe recently released from probation, parole, jail, prison. That can be someone who just doesn't typically trust the voting process. But get 5 new folks to register. Today, actually, I think is the last day to register online. But once early voting starts again and election day comes around, folks can register at the polls. So get 5 new folks registered and get them to request absentee ballots just in case in-person voting or voting at an early voting site isn't the best option for them.
Great, thank you. And if I remember correctly, August 6th is the deadline to request your absentee ballot?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Although the mail system being what it is, everybody should get their ballot request your absentee ballot today, because by the time you get it and you return it, it's got to be returned postmarked by election day, correct?
Right.
So get it as soon as you can, return it as soon as you can.
No, I think it actually has to be it has to be received on election day.
Yes,
Yeah, that's right.
it is received. I was thinking, when she said postmark, I was thinking received. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. Our laws are deliberately confusing and complicated to make it impossible for anybody to figure them out. Thank you so much. Reverend Baring, I just want to ask if you have any final words before we turn to, we have some questions in the chat. So I wanted to, but I wanted to give you a chance.
I just I thank Shauntay and Ryeshia for all that they put into this, and the websites are helpful. I look back with just voting and the whole issue with systemic racism and the suppression of voting and all of the things that go on around the country to suppress voting. And it's more than a notion to get people registered, to get people to the polls, to get people informed of candidates. And it, like the old saying, it takes the whole village to raise a child. And I think it takes a mass effort by people to engage people, to get them to the poll. This year, election November, it's so important for people to get to the polls and vote this time around. Whatever happens this next year will impact my grandchildren and probably their children. So I think this is an issue that should really be lifted up. I know all of the other issues that are going on with gun violence and whatever, but right now the main issue before us is voting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat, and Daniel also will chime in with questions that have come in through Facebook. So we have a question from earlier on this evening when I think Shauntay was talking about how as we vote and as we are engaged with our elected officials, that makes them pay more attention and be more accountable to our issues. But somebody in the chat said, why do the Democrats take the Black and Brown communities for granted, and how do organizations help to hold our elected officials accountable even when we do vote for them?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It is my opinion that both Republicans and Democrats take many of our folks within our communities for granted. I think people have taken the vote for granted. So it is sometimes openly done because Democrats are typically the representatives of those Black and Brown communities. But then we can also see it in things like gerrymandering, where in the state of Wisconsin specifically, I know gerrymandering happens on both sides, both Republicans and Dems, but in the state of Wisconsin, gerrymandering has been a real thing. And that is legitimately taking the votes for granted. It's almost as though, well, I don't have to listen to you. I don't have to respond to you. And I think as an organization, just being able to, this is a thing, I had a conversation just the other day with someone, and I just said, listen, we have, for too long, and this is going to sound a little harsh, but it is my truth. For too long, organizations have been very persistent in pimping Black and Brown people. And what I mean by that is this. We look and we say, we want to turn folks out and we want to make sure that they engage and things of that nature, but it becomes very much so like outside of that engagement and turning folks out to meet our quota, we don't really have relationship with Black and Brown people in Black and Brown communities. And so my thought process, I was speaking with someone and they wanted to know kind of how do I talk to, how do I get folks to turn out and what's the messaging? And I just told them, I said, listen, I told them a Facebook page to go to. I said, go to this particular page, see when the next protest is, and go out there and talk to the folks on the front line. And so from my perspective, that you don't have to go that drastic as an organization, but I will say there is a real need to build relationship with organizers as well as Black and brown people if we're really trying to encourage folks to turn out, because no one, I don't care what your race is, I don't care what your creed is, no one wants to feel like they've been used. And so whether that is used by Democrats or used by Republicans, so many times we have pimped Black and brown people for their vote. They don't have confidence in anything that we're going to say, because we come with the same thing every cycle, like, oh, it's important to turn out, and this is why it's important to turn out. But then when those same individuals are out there marching for their lives, we're out there marching for our lives, or we're out and we're standing against something that is serious, we don't see those same organizations backing us up. So I think from that perspective, really, if we're going to get into this, when we talk about systemic racism and systemic change, I've always said, I'm after the change. I want to work myself out of a position and not just maintain so that I keep a job. I have to position myself where I'm doing things that are borderline radical to radical, so that I can change the system. Because in order to change the system, it takes all of us getting involved in a real way on the ground, not from this high level. I just want to make sure that I give you funding and I throw a bunch of things at you and tell you a bunch of strategies and all of that. No, get in this fight with us and help us to change. Use your organizational power to help to change some of these laws.
I think
Thank you.
that was well said. A long time ago, I used to sit and say that I was just for one party. And after I became a pastor, I found out that I'm for the person that's going to do the best for my people. I don't care what party you are, or the one that's going to be the best for my people, the one that's going to collaborate, that's going to be on the ground with my people. And so I think that's one of the misconceptions we have as people of color. And I think Ryeshia said that pimping Black and brown people, because if you look at it, we're still in the same position we've been in for years with disparities. We voted Democrat, we voted Republican, well, we're still in the same position. People tell us one thing before they're elected, and then we find ourselves in the same position. So we need to be educated. We need to elect people that are going to serve our best interests. I don't care whether it's a school board, I don't care where it is, whoever we elect, whoever we put in, has to be somebody that is going to help us.
Thank you. Ryeshia, did you want to add anything before we go to another question?
No, I think Reverend Baring and Shauntay nailed it.
Thank you. So it's a very practical question. And I know it's something that we've all been talking about in our different coalitions. Is there a plan to provide poll workers in Milwaukee? And I know that's a huge concern, not just in Milwaukee, primarily Milwaukee, but not just in Milwaukee, of how we're going to recruit poll workers.
I'll say yes to keep it quick. So I've been working with the newly appointed clerk, and we have a call tomorrow with a new hire that is the deputy there, and we are working through infrastructure to carry out that plan. So hopefully within the next week or two, we'll have something that can be pushed out.
Great, thank you. Just want to ask Daniel if there are questions coming in from Facebook that we want to answer.
There have actually not been any questions yet from Facebook, so I think our viewers are hopefully understanding everything.
Great, great. So I know this, that I think Shauntay mentioned this, but just to emphasize a little bit, if we could, maybe Ryeshia, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of the census and the connection between the census and voting.
Sure. So the census deals a lot with, we talked about districting. The census lets us know who is where, essentially. So who are making up our communities? Where do they live in the communities? How are we properly, ideally, how are we equitably distributing resources to these different communities? That includes money, that includes, social services, a bunch of different things. But the census just helps us know who is where, and so we can make sure that we're sharing resources evenly across our different communities. The way that relates to voting, most obviously, is when it comes time to redistrict and look at where our voting districts are. The census helps inform how evenly we're drawing the lines or not. And so people participating in the census not only determines, what resources are going into your community organizations, but it also determines, how far your voting district stretches ultimately. And so, one argument is, even if you're not voting for yourself, vote for the people in your community who really care about what happens to it, because otherwise the lines may be drawn to minimize the resources and the voice of your districts.
Thank you. So I have a question for
the process right now of picking people for the panel that's going to do the redistricting. I know I received a notice about that. They're getting ready to start setting up that panel for the people who will be on that panel for redistricting. And so it's really important.
Yeah, something we all need to be paying attention to. So I have a question for Shauntay and for Ryeshia. What can people do on election day if they either themselves are coming upon a barrier to voting, or they see somebody being discriminated against, or for some reason having their ballot rejected? Is there any recourse that anybody has?
Yeah, there's two things. First, they can call election protection. You can call election protection now if you're having trouble, registering or requesting a ballot or whatever have you. And the hotline number for that is 866-OUR-VOTE. Election protection is full of a team of lawyers, national lawyers, but some of which are also in Wisconsin, who can help, who know the voting laws best, who can answer your questions. But if your vote is seriously being disenfranchised, they can best give you counsel on what grounds you have to take further action, aside from just getting your questions answered. But typically on election day, I know in the state of Wisconsin, this is true, especially in Milwaukee, there are what's called legal observers who come from a number of different groups. I know the ACLU of Wisconsin has a few legal observers on the ground, but these are people who are trained to understand what poll workers are legally responsible for, and how election processes at polling places should legally work. And so they're observing to make sure that everything is running as it should and smoothly, and that folks are not being disenfranchised. So I hope if it brings anyone any solace, we deploy people on the ground to make sure that, wherever people's votes are being disenfranchised, we can either speak to the white coat. I can't remember the name of the person right now, the chief inspector, who's on site for a polling location and ask, what we can do about this. Or, we'll take that back to our organizations and decide if there's any further advocacy that needs to happen to make elections run more smoothly and not enfranchise upon people's rights.
And I'll share.
Go ahead, Shauntay.
One more resource. I'm sorry. It's also an ACLU. So I'll share this as well. On election
What
day.
I forget.
No, it's okay. On election day, but even now, there is a Facebook page called Wisconsin Election Protection. And you can share, and that particular page is also monitored. It's monitored very consistent on election day during that election process. Outside of that, I do believe, and Ryeshia, correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe that it is monitored, just not as consistent leading up to an election, but I do know that there is some monitoring as well. So Wisconsin election Protection on Facebook.
No, our lawyer that manages the Facebook page is pretty on it consistently. But we also have Twitter and Instagram Wisconsin Election Protection pages, and those are, I think, monitored a little bit less. But I know the Facebook page is watched pretty closely by one of our lawyers.
Great. And I know also the League of Women Voters recruits people to be poll watchers. I've been a poll watcher. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't even really have to know all that much. They tell you what to look out for, and it's an important thing to do to help protect people's rights. So those are all the questions that we have. So I want to give you each a chance to say any last words. One most important thought that you want to leave people with, or most important action that you want people to take. And then Peter and I have something to share with you all about a new app that we are working on that we're going to unveil to you all. So Reverend Baring, do you want to say some last words?
I would say to everyone viewing, make sure you vote and take some others with you to vote. It is important, it is important, it is important that you vote.
Thank you. Shauntay?
I will basically echo what Reverend Baring just stated, as well as making sure that if we do nothing else in this time, one of the things that, and I'll connect this to our time that we're all experiencing together, which is COVID, right? COVID-19 and this pandemic. It has taught us how to be communal in a way that we have maybe not been able to be communal in times past. And so understanding that this voting, the act of voting is a community event. It's not just an individual event. And so when we understand that it is a community event and that my vote impacts my neighbor and their vote impacts another neighbor, then we can see the importance of making sure that every vote counts and just remembering to vote in every election, be it local or federal elections. I think is really important as well. And if you have questions or concerns, you can also reach out to any of us whom are a part of this. I'll just share. You can follow us at Voting is Local, as well as there's another thing that you can follow, which is Vote, and you can get updated information around electoral processes, as well as when laws change concerning our elections.
Thank you. Ryeshia?
Yeah, and I'll try not to be long-winded because I have a few things to say. But first, I want to say that from a very personal standpoint, it's important for me to exercise my right to vote, because otherwise I feel as though I'm allowing others to make decisions about what goes on in my daily life. And that's decisions from, what my friend who's a mom, what her school situation is, what the potholes outside of my street do and don't look like, what I'm allowed to do with my body as a woman, what my city council is going to do about folks being tear gassed and rubber bulleted in the streets for demonstrating against police violence. And so if I want to have a role in all those conversations, I think voting is a major way to do that. And so I encourage you all to just think about day to day, what are the things that you feel like, man, I wish I had more control over, like, man, I wish I could change this thing. Who's responsible for that thing? And then who should you be voting for as a result? That's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is, I know that, we did some preparation for this panel prior to tonight, and, we didn't even get to speak to all the pieces that we wanted to speak to. This is also just an hour, 10-minute conversation. You should definitely continue talking to other people, because you just got a few of probably a million perspectives. The way that systemic racism impacts people is endless. Unfortunately. And so there's a lot more to learn and a lot more conversations to be had. So please take opportunities to continue learning and to continue doing your own mental brain work outside of this. The last thing I'll say is that the ACLU, now that we've launched a voting rights campaign this year, we're looking for volunteers who are interested in working on voting rights. And so one major example is we have a phone bank coming up that will start this week. We're hosting a training for that tomorrow. There's a number of other ways that we've been working on voting rights this year, and I'd love to get anyone interested involved. So I'm going to drop my email in the chat, and if you're interested in engaging in the ACLU's voting rights work, then please reach out.
That's fabulous. Thank you. And, one of the goals of the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign is to connect our volunteers to the work that you all are doing. So we want to hear about your phone banking, and we want to hear about your volunteer activities and opportunities. And we want to push that information out to our now almost 280 volunteers in Madison and Milwaukee and Kenosha and other parts of the state. So we can send all of them to you so that we can increase your capacity to do the amazing work that you are already doing.
Phone banking is a way to empower people. That's the way we defeated the voter ID in Minnesota, with the phone banking, and changed the mindset of all the people that were in favor of that voter ID. And they told us we would never get that overturned, and we did by phone banking. And so they don't have a voter ID law in Minnesota now.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's take inspiration from that. Peter, do you want to say something about our relational organizing and wrap us up?
Sure. And I'll try to say it as succinctly as I can. Each one of us is, within our social networks, we're the best messenger. We're people, the people that we know where we're coming from. They trust us. We can be good sources of information and encouragement to those people. And what we are launching is relational voting. It's working with, it's recruiting volunteers to reach out to the people that they know, friends, family, neighbors, coworkers. Unlike phone banking, it's not, cold calling people that you don't know, that don't know you. But it's reaching out, letting them know important information about voting, talking to them about why voting is important to you, learning about what's important to them. And what we're wanting to use, what we're sort of rolling out, is a tool that people can use on their computer or their phone, which will help them to build their list of contacts. They will receive periodic calls to action, topics and things to talk to their networks about, not a script. These are sort of like natural, organic conversations, but different topics at different times that people can reach out and talk to their friends about. And, then, kind of, track and report so we kind of know how this is working. But, what's really important is that this has been shown to be an extremely effective way to get new voters or people who, haven't been very consistent in their voting activities to really to turn out the vote. And so I invite, everyone on this call to stay in contact with the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign to learn more about it, because it's a very simple way in which people can volunteer to be messengers about these important issues, and to help build the kind of groundswell of voter engagement that we really need to see in the state if things are going to change, and if our elected officials, whoever they wind up being, know that they're being watched and being held to account.
Thank you, Peter. I want to thank our speakers. This has been so amazing, and I definitely want to echo Ryeshia that this should be the first of many conversations, and that there is so much more to learn and to wrap our brains around and to wrestle with. Thank you so much for being willing to share your experience, your expertise, and really your own experiences. It's so valuable. Thank you. We will have this the recording up on YouTube shortly. Please, everybody, follow up with the information that's been put in the chat. Follow up with All Voting is Local. Follow up with the ACLU. Please be available to volunteer and to be part of this important work. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Do the same
Bye all.
thing.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good
everyone.
night. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.